Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. Striking and hot developments from Ukraine regarding the Russian army and Ukrainian army continue. Due to the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, almost no Russian soldier has been able to close his eyes and sleep comfortably in recent days. Russian soldiers are tired and demoralized on the Ukrainian fronts. Ukrainian warriors made an assertive entrance to the city with long vehicle convoys with the decision of Russian army to withdraw from Kherson, which is located in the south of Ukraine and was first captured by Russian soldiers at the beginning of the occupation. The withdrawal of the Russian army brought to mind the question of whether the Russian army is collapsing. The withdrawal of the Russian army from Kherson did not happen all at once. The Ukrainian army has continued its attacks against the Russian front on the Kherson border for months. Within the framework of Ukraine's attack plan, it first aimed to cut off aid to the Russian army. Within the framework of their plans, the Ukrainian warriors managed to shatter the logistic networks that reached the Russian army with their effective attacks. The Russian army caused Russia to take a radical decision, as the aid routes to Kherson were blocked by the attacks of the Ukrainian soldiers. Russia decided to withdraw Russian soldiers from Kherson and declared that this decision was based on compelling reasons. The withdrawal of the Russian army from Kherson fell on the agenda like a bomb. War commentators interpreted the retreat in Kherson as the Russian army's loss of power and collapse in Ukraine. But was the Russian army really on the brink of a cliff in Ukraine? The Russian army has almost completely lost its ability to withstand the Ukrainian attacks. The blows from the Ukrainian attacks did not even allow the Russian army to get up from the ground. Many Russian officers and Russian soldiers lost their belief that the occupation in Ukraine will achieve its purpose. And in the last days, especially in the Russian army, Russian soldiers announced their resignation one after another. The developments in the Russian army brought the question of whether the Russian army was disintegrating to the agenda again. The Russian army lost a lot of blood to the Russian army, not only with the resignations within itself, but also with the resignation of the mercenaries serving the Russian army during the occupation of Ukraine. As Vladimir Putin's army continues to be badly dispersed, Russia has allegedly been increasingly reliant on mercenary groups. Russian President Vladimir Putin, as Ukraine's rapidly rising momentum continues, the Russian leader falls in an increasingly desperate situation in the occupation of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, on the other hand, is very pleased with the achievements of the heroic Ukrainian soldiers. Zelensky saw Ukrainian troops retake the city of Kherson last week. In recent months, they have made good progress in their counterattack, advancing also the east and near the city of Kharkiv. The same cannot be said for the Russian army in Ukraine. The dark clouds of Russian leader Putin's army in Ukraine never disappeared over them. Former British Army officer Sir Simon Mayle painted a bleak picture of the Russian army's future in the war. Sir Simon Mayle says the Russian army is disintegrating in Ukraine, but warns Ukraine still has a long way to go before it can declare victory. Sir Simon Mayle, a former British Army officer, said, "There are quite a lot of Ukrainian troops east of the Dnieper River, but there are substantial numbers of Russian soldiers on the contrary." Sir Simon Mayle, Zelensky was pretty good at managing expectations throughout the war. I think on a tactical and operational level, we can see that the momentum is in Ukraine's favor. Things are going very badly for the Russians. But we shouldn't be too optimistic. We may get lucky, the morale of the Russian forces may collapse completely, but we just have to manage expectations, he added. Mr. Mayoral also looked at the Russians' attempts to turn the tide of the war. After Putin's men lost towns and villages near Kharkiv in September, he announced that he would mobilize the population to bring in more troops, he said. Mayoral, however, these men are untrained, and so Putin also turned to Mystery's military mercenaries for extra help. Chief among the mercenaries, the Russian military has turned to fight in Ukraine, and the highest profile of this is the Wagner group, founded by Putin ally Yevgeny Prigozhin, who previously denied any involvement with the group and later confirmed that he created the group himself. Mr. Mayoral expressed his views on the role the Wagner group could play in the war in Ukraine. In Russia, the regular army has almost been destroyed. We know the motivation, equipment and training of the conscripted army is inadequate. That's why Putin recruits mercenaries, a kind of private security, military company like the Wagner group, and closely linked to the United States, Mayoral said. Mayoral of the Russian Wagner group, they are murderous people, weapons of fire with a brutal value of their own. Probably many are ultranationalist Russians who feel the mystical commitment to saving Russia from humiliation, she added. It has been widely reported that the Russian Wagner group is already in Ukraine. His mercenaries are accused of aiding the Russian military in committing the heinous war crimes documented in formerly occupied territories. Russian Wagner Group leader Prigozhin had to deny this week that Wagner soldiers were involved in the execution of one of his fighters. This came after a video shared on social media by an account linked to Wagner. In unconfirmed footage, a man accused of switching sides to fight against the Russians was murdered. The man named Yevgeny Nuzhin was heard to say, "I was hit on the head and lost consciousness and wandered around this cellar. They told me I would be judged," he said. Then he was hit with a sledgehammer. However, Prigozhin falsely claimed that Nuzhin was killed by the United States in his statement. "I asked the Wagner employees if they had kidnapped Yevgeny Nuzhin and participated in his torture." He said none of them gave any information about his participation in the kidnapping or torture. "It is very clear to me that Nuzhin was abducted and brutally murdered by agents of the US intelligence service," Yevgeny Nuzhin said. In Russia, the problems are complicated, the chaos and riots do not end. Putin faces some serious problems inside Russia amid growing domestic pressure. Vladimir Putin is grappling with mounting internal pressure as Russian citizens become aware of the Russian army's repeated defeats on the battlefield, said a former NATO ambassador. Former NATO ambassador Kirk Volker said the latest wave of Russian attacks on Ukraine is the latest sign that Vladimir Putin is under increasing pressure in Russia. The repeated failures and retreats of Russian forces from the battlefield show that Russia has been met with nationwide counterattacks against Ukraine, and missiles are raining down on major Ukrainian cities. Volker argued that Putin's position had become untenable. He said that despite the Kremlin's war propaganda, Russian citizens are becoming more and more aware of the reality of the war. Volker said, "I think Putin is facing some serious problems inside Russia, which everybody knows that his war against Ukraine has failed and has deeply damaged Russia both military and economically said." Looking at the situation in Volker Kherson, he added, "The interesting thing here is that Russia didn't win the war. They couldn't hold the lands they had already taken." Volker also mentioned that the Ukrainian army has been quite successful in dealing with the Russian attacks. Ukraine is pushing them back. We saw it in eastern Kharkiv, we saw it in Donbass. We have seen it now around Kherson, and this will continue. I think the Ukrainians will continue to recall the region, he said. The former NATO ambassador added that Vladimir followed the same tactics to retaliate against Ukraine when Russian forces backed down. All Russia can do is territorialize Ukrainian city by dropping bombs on them, forcing people into bunker by cutting off electricity. Former NATO ambassador, despite all the pressure from Russia, Ukraine will not give up. They will continue to fight and eventually Russia will be defeated, said. In these days, when the flame of the war is rising, a new development has attracted all eyes. Tension literally escalated after a Russian-made missile hit NATO member Poland on Tuesday, killing 2 people. The missile landed outside the Polish rural village of Przewodów on Tuesday afternoon, about 4 miles west of the Ukrainian border, as Russia launched a new wave of missiles at Ukrainian cities. The incident, in which a NATO member was directly shot for the first time, raises question about whether NATO will trigger Article 5 and respond to the attack. Calling his country's National Security Council, the Polish president said authorities were unable to determine who launched the missiles. It was most likely a Russian-made missile, but all of this is still under investigation at the moment, said. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is chairing the North Atlantic Council meeting in Brussels and addresses the explosion in eastern Poland, and Poland will seek consultation under Article 4 of the NATO agreement. While the balances in the war in Ukraine are changing day by day, recent developments have shown us that the extent of the war is not limited to Ukraine alone. We are witnessing that the Russian army is taking a more aggressive stance in Ukraine with each passing day. Thank you for watching us.